Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. Episode 47, Meetings and Agreements. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting as usual from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa, Canada. Last episode I described the oppression of Jewish and other minorities in Germany and its occupied territories from 1940 to 1945. Their transportation to ghettos, then to camps, then to extermination, or as plain-speaking people like me like to call it, murder. The episode concluded with the doomed Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April and May 1943. So that's where we are in this chronological narrative where I'm trying to roughly track the development of the Second World War on the Eastern Front from June 1941 to its conclusion in 1945, and perhaps a little bit beyond. We're in April-May 1943. It's a period of not inactivity on the Eastern Front, but little movement. That doesn't mean there was no fighting going on. There was plenty of fighting and plenty of casualties. A good indication of this is the dispatches from American journalist Bill Downs, CBS's Moscow correspondent at the time. He reported continuing air warfare in March and April along the front, as well as small-scale fighting as Germans sent out scouting parties to test the Soviet defenses all along the line. He also reported on German assaults on the city of Izium, citing the site of fighting in 2022, by the way. And of course, there was almost continuous fighting in the Kuban bridgehead opposite the Kerch Peninsula to the south in southern Russia. So war, as we can see, never stops, even after a big battle. A couple of episodes back, I described the winter of 1943 as the return of movement to the Eastern Front after the largely stagnant grind of Stalingrad. The Soviets launched several operations in the winter with celestial names like Ernest, the liberation of Stalingrad and the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, Saturn, Mars, Star, and Polar Star. The Soviets pushed the Germans back hundreds of kilometers from Stalingrad, as well as in Army Groups North and Center's areas. More accurately, though, it was the Germans who withdrew. Von Manstein, commander by this time of Army Group South, convinced Hitler to allow a withdrawal west of the Don River in January and February 1943. This allowed the Soviet Voronezh front temporarily to capture Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine in February. And they actually went beyond that, almost reaching the Dnieper River before von Manstein's counteroffensive pushed them back, and they recaptured Kharkiv by 15th March. I described all this in detail in episode 45, so if you need a refresher, feel free to go back and listen to it again after you finish listening to this one. Don't touch that dial. Meanwhile, to the north, the Germans withdrew from the Demyansk pocket south of Leningrad and the Rzhev salient west of Moscow, just before the Soviets could launch operations they thought could surround the Germans. This allowed the invaders to shorten their lines and strengthen their defenses, and it also freed up about 21 divisions for deployment elsewhere. By March 1943, the Eastern Front was largely where it had been a year earlier, if a little farther back around Leningrad, and of course without those deep salients at Demyansk and Rzhev, and with the addition of a new salient, but a Soviet one. 115 miles or 185 kilometers north to south, and 80 miles or 130 kilometers west to east, between the still German-held cities of Averell and Belgorod, and centered on Soviet-held Kursk. You can see this in the map on the web page for this episode, beyondbarbarossa.ca. To quote from Sean McMeekin's groundbreaking 2021 book, Stalin's War, when the Rasputitsa came flooding later that March, a lull descended on the Eastern Front as both armies licked their wounds from the intense winter battles, formed new armored divisions, and called up reserves." End quote. But the Bezoriya season, in Russian Rasputitsa, or season of no roads, means no one moves because the spring thaw and rains have turned the ground into thick, cloying mud. This pause in fighting is supported by the relatively low casualty figures. Less fighting, fewer casualties. The 3 months between April and June 1943 had the lowest casualty rates for both sides for any 3-month period of the entire war. This pause also gave both sides an opportunity to plan, to evaluate, to reformulate their strategy. Now, some things remain the same. With the withdrawal or the retreat of German forces all along the Eastern Front, Hitler wanted to respond in some way, even to leverage von Manstein's victory at Kharkiv. The German High Command, the OKH, which is the Army High Command, and the OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, looked at that big bulge at Kursk. To quote from Anthony Tucker Jones's book, Slaughter on the Eastern Front, Hitler and Stalin's War, 1941 to 1945. In the run-up to the spring of 1943, General Kurt Zeitzler, the German Army Chief of Staff, was preoccupied with Hitler's Operation Zitadel, or Citadel. Hitler's intention was to snip off the Soviet Kursk salient at its neck and smash those Soviet forces trapped in an enormous pocket. To that end, he began to mass his armored forces. End quote. Hitler's directive on Citadel in April 1943 included this statement, quote, "The victory at Kursk must have the effect of a beacon seen around the world." End quote. A beacon especially for his allies. There was a problem with this idea, though, of a huge operation to trap millions of Soviet soldiers in this immense pocket, which would have been bigger than any of the already immense pockets they had captured in 1941. The problem was that after the defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans were weaker than they had been in 1941. They had fewer men to commit, fewer tanks and guns and airplanes. Not only that, they were fighting the Allies in North Africa and losing. To quote again from Anthony Tucker Jones, this plan had first been discussed in April with the view to decisively weakening the Red Army's offensive strength. In light of Stalingrad and the unraveling of the German Southern Front, such large-scale offensive operations seemed completely out of the question. End quote. The German High Command were divided. Zeitzler, the Chief of Staff and the main proponent of the plan, wanted to strike as soon as possible to catch the Soviets off guard before they had a chance to build up their defenses. After the victory at Kharkiv, von Manstein also wanted to press an immediate attack on the Central Front. But others weren't so sure. General Field Marshal Walter Model was against it. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff of the OKW, High Command of the Wehrmacht, was reluctant to commit yet more forces to the Eastern Front, considering the advancing Allies in North Africa and the Mediterranean. And they were pretty sure that the Allies would then invade somewhere on the Mediterranean. There was that Operation Mincemeat, devised by none other than Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels, where the British put a body in the water, the Mediterranean, dressed in a British Army uniform with fake plans in its pocket, alluding to a planned invasion of Greece. But I'm getting away from the topic here. Anyway, the Germans were pretty sure that the Allies, having won in North Africa, would then turn their attentions to Europe somewhere. So back to the German High Command. General Hurrying Heinz Guderian, now the inspector of armored troops for the Wehrmacht, also opposed Operation Citadel. Just he knew, probably better than anyone else, they didn't have the strength for a big operation. The issue was the central problem for Germany in this war. They just did not have the resources to fight a two-front war, not with the Allies pretty much having wrapped up North Africa in the spring, and Stalin calling loudly and often for a second front in Western Europe. So Hitler hesitated to commit to Citadel or anything else. Coincidentally, or maybe it's not a coincidence, Stalin was hesitating about big plans and commitments on his side. So that brings us to the question of what is each side's long-term strategy? What were their war goals at this point? That's a question that still is debated among historians. According to some of those historians, it was clear to German commanders, including Hitler, that Germany could not win a war in the East. They could not defeat the Soviet Union. So why did they still plan major offensive operations? And what about the Allies? The Western Allies, the US and UK and their other smaller allies. What was their goal? Well, for the rest of this episode, I'm going to take a few steps back and look at the development of the long-term strategy through the lens of discussions between the various partners, the Axis, that is, the dictators at the top of each respective country, as well as the discussions among the Allies. Let's start with August 1939, when German diplomats, officials, and photographers, headed by Nazi Minister of Foreign Affairs Joachim von Ribbentrop, headed to Moscow to meet the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Together, they negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it's commonly called now, officially the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Ostensibly, it was an agreement not to go to war and to develop trade and closer relations between the two countries. Secretly, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe between the two dictatorships. When Germany invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, the USSR followed suit 2 weeks later, and the dictators divided Poland between them. In 1940, the USSR invaded and occupied Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the Baltic coast. In July 1940, Adolf Hitler summoned Joseph Tiso, the so-called president of the Nazi client state of the First Slovak Republic. The idea was basically to, put the Slovaks in their place when it came to carrying out Nazi policy. In October 1940, Hitler met with Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. They discussed the possibility of Spain officially joining the Axis, but apparently Franco's price for that was too rich for Hitler's blood. The talks came to little. Soon after that, Hitler met with Marshal Philippe Pétain, chief of the collaborationist Vichy France regime, in the town of Montoire-sur-Loire, France. They discussed Vichy France's place in the, quote, new European order, unquote, as defined by the Nazis. But neither side agreed to what the other side wanted, and they kind of dropped it. It was all very vague, and nothing really came of it. Nothing really changed. Then in October and November 1940, Soviet and Nazi officials held more talks. Remember, at this point, they're still operating under their non-aggression pact. The topic was, I hope you're sitting down for this, the possibility of the USSR joining the Axis as its fourth member, along with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Then on either the 7th or 8th April 1943, the date depends on which source you look at, Hitler and Italian Prime Minister and dictator Benito Mussolini met in Salzburg, Austria, to discuss the Allies' victories in Africa and the probability of an invasion of Italy. Apparently, Mussolini wasn't feeling too happy about being in the Axis, but he couldn't really get out of it. And Hitler was kind of disgusted at the Italians for not holding up their end. So that's all the meetings. You'll notice that there weren't many after this point. There were still some further meetings between Hitler and Mussolini. But most of their meetings were before June 1941. The Allies, on the other hand, started meeting fairly early in the war and continued throughout. The meetings of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin are iconic of the alliance of the big three of the Second World War. You can all remember the pictures, and I've put a few on the website. But those images leave out really important aspects of the war, such as the role that China played in Asia, and the probably more important meetings of the military, diplomatic, and governmental representatives all through the war. These somewhat lower level meetings, just under the summit, may have been even more important because they got down to some of the details on how the grand strategies would play out. So, now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty details of the many Allied conferences during the war. But first, it's time for a short break. I'll be right back, so don't touch that dial. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. Beyond Barbarossa is still, as far as I can tell, the only English language podcast in the world that focuses on the Eastern Front of World War II. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more about my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel. And all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Thanks for coming back. Now we're taking a look at the Allied conferences that took place starting in 1941 and continued through the war. It started with the Anglo-Soviet Agreement. On 22nd June 1941, one day into the Nazi invasion of the USSR, just after the very beginning of Operation Barbarossa, they went beyond Barbarossa. See what I did there? Anyway, on the 22nd of June, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced on radio that Britain and the Soviet Union now faced a common enemy. Churchill had always loudly opposed communism, which he still called Bolshevism even in 1941. He had been more than appalled at the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact. And even though he didn't know at the time when the news came out that it included these secret protocols to divide Eastern Europe between the two tyrannies. So when Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, Churchill said to his private secretary, John Colville, quote, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." End quote. I thought about trying a Churchill imitation there, but it was awful. Anyway, back to the story. Britain right away began sharing intelligence with the USSR, including intercepts of Nazi military communications decrypted by its Ultra project. Ultra was the Allies' greatest secret of the war. The fact that Polish decryptors had worked out how to decode the Germans' Enigma code. On 12th July, 3 weeks after the launch of Barbarossa, Britain's ambassador to the USSR, Sir Stafford Cripps, and Soviet Foreign Affairs Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov signed the Anglo-Soviet Agreement. While the negotiations were fraught with mutual suspicion, the two sides agreed to cooperate to defeat Nazi Germany and not to make a separate peace. In other words, neither side would sue for peace terms with Germany unless the other side did at the same time. The U.S. still was not officially in the war, but with Roosevelt's guidance, they were supporting the U.K. Harry Hopkins was U.S. President Roosevelt's envoy and director of the Lend-Lease program. He met with Stalin in Moscow on 30th July 1941, so a month after the beginning of Barbarossa. Hopkins informed the Soviet leader that the United States was resolved to support the USSR with vital supplies, if only they would, 80 years later, resolve to actually deliver support to Ukraine. But I digress. Lend-Lease shipments to the USSR began soon after. They first arrived at Russia's Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel. In August, Britain and the Soviet Union cooperated in a joint invasion of Iran to open another supply route. See episode 32 on Lend-Lease for more details after you finish this episode. Don't touch that dial. While gracious about the Lend-Lease aid, Stalin, being Stalin, asked for more. On 3rd September, so we're still before the U.S. is officially in the war, Stalin asked Churchill for a second front in Western Europe. That is, for Britain to launch an invasion across the English Channel. This would divide German forces and take some pressure off the USSR. Churchill knew that was impossible, for the time being at least. Still, he let himself get pressured into promising a second front the following year. That is, 1942. I know what you're thinking, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The second summit meeting of allies was in Argentia. Yes, that's the correct pronunciation. It's spelled Argentia, but it's pronounced Argentia, as I have been informed in no uncertain terms by certain Newfoundlanders who will not be toyed with. Anyway, Argentia on Placentia Bay in Newfoundland, between U.S. President Roosevelt and U.K. Prime Minister Churchill, from 9 to 12 August 1941. As you can imagine, the meeting required the highest levels of security and deception because both leaders had to travel across the ocean. All these summit and high-level meetings require that kind of security, and the long trips were very hard on Roosevelt, who was in a wheelchair by this point. Many of the participants on both sides had no idea where they were going when they boarded warships to get to the meeting in Argentia. Churchill brought along what he called, quote, golden eggs, a few ultra decrypts to impress Roosevelt. Their discussions were wide-ranging, including the danger of Spain joining the Axis, the threat from Japan, and what kind of support they could deliver to the USSR. The outcome was the Atlantic Charter, which stated, among other things, The US and the British Empire would not seek territorial gains through the war. Territorial adjustments must be in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. All people had a right to self-determination. Trade barriers would be lowered. There would be global economic cooperation and advancement of social welfare. The participants, the US and the British Empire, would work, quote, for a world free of want and fear, end quote. Also for freedom of the seas, and the aggressor nations in the war would be disarmed, followed by a common disarmament after the war. Very ambitious goals, even 80 years later. That phrase, all people have the right to self-determination, would come to bite both signatories after the war. Because, the British Empire was an empire with many colonies all around the world. And in a sense, so did the US. We'll come back to that. Also, Stalin would later insist on the international borders as they existed in May 1941, not in 1939. Those borders that he wanted gave the USSR control over the Baltic states, half of Poland, and large areas of Finland. But again, that's getting ahead of our story. For the first Moscow Conference from 29 September to 1 October 1941, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov hosted Averell Harriman, Roosevelt's representative, and the Canadian Max Aitken, who was also more well known as Lord Beaverbrook, the UK's Minister of Supply. 3 days of negotiations led to an agreement by the Western Allies to supply the USSR with 400 aircraft, 500 tanks, and 10,000 trucks per month, plus other supplies crucial to the Soviet Union's war effort. The Arcadia Conference, also known as the First Washington Conference, brought together Churchill and Roosevelt again, along with a lot of top military officers, the heads of the air forces, navies, and armies of their respective sides, between 22nd December 1941 and 14 January 1942. So that's a long conference. It led to two important decisions with big long-term impacts. First was Europe first. In other words, the countries would concentrate on defeating Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy before taking on Imperial Japan. I mean, they would still fight more or less concurrently, but the first focus would be Germany before Japan. The other big momentous decision was the declaration by United Nations. Not the United Nations, but the declaration by United Nations. This statement formalized the Allies with the Big Four, the US, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and China, along with 22 other nations like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, as well as the European governments in exile, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Norway, and Yugoslavia, and many others. The purpose of the United Nations was the defeat of fascism. At the Third Inter-Allied Conference in London on 13 January 1942, the exiled governments in London declared punishment for Nazis for war crimes committed against civilians. Through all this time, from that first meeting in July 1941 until 1942, Stalin pressured for a second front relentlessly. He especially pressured Churchill. So, at the Second Washington Conference in June 1942, 1 year after the launch of Barbarossa, Churchill and Roosevelt settled on opening a second front, but in North Africa, not in France. The raid on Dieppe by Canadian forces in August 1942 was supposed to test the Germans' defenses on the French coast and perhaps mollify Stalin on the idea of the second front in Europe. The raid failed on both counts. So Churchill traveled once again to the Soviet Union, along with Roosevelt's envoy William Harriman, to the Second Moscow Conference in August 1942. They went to try to explain to Stalin that a cross-channel invasion of Europe was impossible in 1942. Stalin did not take it well. Churchill and Roosevelt met again at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. They invited Stalin to attend too, but he declined. He had a good excuse. January 1943 was the time that Operation Ernest was in full swing to liberate Stalingrad. And Stalin was deeply involved in planning those celestially named operations of the winter of 1943. So Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, etc. Also, Stalin was notoriously paranoid and feared, probably with really good reason, that if he left the center of control in Moscow, he might not be able to come back. According to Sean McMeekin, Roosevelt felt insulted and hurt by Stalin's refusal, which strangely made him try harder and to offer more to bring Stalin around. He felt, according to many historians, that he could charm Stalin into accepting the Western Allies' goals and aspirations. Stalin continued to rebuff him, though, and that attitude was reflected in Soviet policy, such as arresting and imprisoning Allied airmen who crash-landed on Soviet territory. They even imprisoned some of the participants in the famous Doolittle air raid on Japan on 18 April 1942 who crash-landed in the Soviet Far East. And the Soviets imprisoned these supposedly Allied airmen for over a year. The important outcome of the Casablanca Conference, though, was that the Allies would only accept the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. No negotiation. This surprised and kind of bemused Churchill and Stalin, but Roosevelt was quite adamant on it. The next big conference took place in April from the 19th to the 30th, 1943, in Bermuda, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This was not a summit, but British and American delegations, including senior military people, discussed Jewish refugees already freed and those still in Nazi-occupied Europe. This was shortly followed by the third Washington Conference from May 12 to 25th. Churchill, Roosevelt, and General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, planned the Italian campaign. They also settled on increased air raids on Germany, primarily by the Royal Air Force, and increased operations in the Pacific. Then from 29th May, so just a few days later, to the 4th of June, Churchill took part in the Algiers Planning Conference with diplomatic and military leaders, including Field Marshal Montgomery and General Eisenhower, to finalize the plans for the Italian campaign and set a date for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. And that brings us up to our current point in this chronological track, May 1943. So we can see through these meetings of senior politicians, diplomats, and military leaders a gradual development in the way they thought of the war and their ultimate goals. They began with agreements to cooperate in resisting the Axis and then focusing on Germany first. With the Atlantic Conference, we get idealistic goals for the defeat of fascism, freedom of all people, freedom from fear and want, and the independence of nations. But this would turn out to be way too ambitious, especially as two of the big three were extensive empires ruling over many different nations, and where there were strident independence movements, and nations that the empires did not want to give up. Think of India. Think of Ukraine. And it has been argued that the U.S. had an overseas empire of its own in all but name. After the Atlantic Charter, the successive conferences changed in tone. They became more practical, more worldly. The differences in the national interests, especially of the big three, became more and more apparent. Stalin kept insisting on a second front in France, but that did not meet the national interests of the US or the UK, and that's why they decided on first invading North Africa and then Italy, well before they invaded France. Don't forget, Stalin did not even attend the Casablanca Conference. So not only were the three countries' war interests different, so were their post-war aims. Roosevelt continued to have these high-minded aspirations for freedom, world peace, global cooperation. Churchill, or at least some in the UK, had to have known that the war would mean the end of the British Empire. And yet they clung to the idea of somehow preserving their influence in the world. For his part, Stalin was still intent on spreading communism around the world and extending his control over larger areas, as we would come to see in 1945. He did cancel the Communist International, for the time being at least, to mollify his Western allies. As time and conferences go on, we're going to see the divisions only get wider. But that's a subject for a future episode. So, won't you come back to the next episode and we'll continue our chronological exploration of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. Thank you for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. As usual, I've posted some maps and photos on the webpage for this episode. To see where the Kursk salient was in 1943 and how the Eastern Front by that spring was roughly where it had been 12 months earlier, just go to beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. You can also listen to the episode on my own website, writtenword.ca, and just click on the podcast button in the banner. I want to thank all who have supported the podcast through Patreon. It really makes a difference. So all supporters get advanced, ad-free access to every episode. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. And please consider following Beyond Barbarossa on your preferred podcasting app. I'd really love a rating on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you listen. It really helps spread the word to others who are interested in this part of history. Do you have a question, a comment, clarification, something to add, or, heaven forbid, did you notice I made an error? Please let me know. Reach me by email, contact@beyondbarbarossa.ca, or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina.